Hello everyone, DM Gashbad here. I'm going to be doing something a little bit different today. Although I have a couple of battle reports still to do, what I've mostly been doing recently has been role-playing games and board games. With these, I've been painting up a couple of miniatures to go with them, but of course I'm a really slow painter, so when I paint something, I'd kind of like to be able to bring it back into my main hobby, which is miniature gaming. So today the video is going to be the different board game and role-playing game miniatures that I have made that can also be used in Warhammer Fantasy. This isn't actually going to be a tutorial or anything like that. There's just too many variables to take into account with all the different role-playing games that you can do, all the different board games you can do, and all the different armies and models that are out there. I wouldn't actually be able to give you much advice as far as creating your own board game or role-playing game miniatures that can be usable in Warhammer Fantasy, or the miniature game of your choice. So instead, we're just going to look at some of the models that I've done, the process that I use to make them, that kind of thing, and hopefully that will give you some ideas when it comes time to make your own models. So let's start with the simplest guy first. I'm playing a half-elven ranger in Dungeons & Dragons campaign, and that's going to be this guy here. Now, for whatever reason, elves kind of all sort of go along the same lines. I was just thinking about this. You don't see a whole lot of elven clerics with warhammers or something like that. You got guys with swords and bows, and they're wizards or thieves or warriors or archers, that kind of thing. You don't see a lot of variation. So a lot of the standard Warhammer models that you find work perfectly well for these guys. So in this case, it's an elven ranger. I had a scout all set up. I gave him a brown cloak. I may have actually painted this guy first, and when I went to pick out a model for this game, I said, hey, this guy looks just fine, I'm going to use him. The only strange thing is that me and my wife were both invited to this campaign, and we have kids, so if we both want to show up to a game, we have to get babysitting, which is sometimes kind of a drag. So we had this idea that we would swap off games. So actually this character here, Orinel, has a split personality. Half the time he thinks that he's a guy and he goes by the name Orin, and that's when I play him, and then half the time he thinks that he's a girl, and that is when my wife plays her, and she goes by the name of Nell. So together we are Orinel and we swap back and forth. So when I went to choose this model, I chose a Warhammer High Elf model, a scout, what do you call him? Shadow Warriors. This is an old Shadow Warrior metal model. I chose the one that looks like it could either be male or female. That was my requirement for this miniature here. But other than that, no conversions, nothing like that. Let's go with this guy next. So this is actually not one of my characters. This is a model for a player in the game that I run, that I'm the Dungeon Master for. So this is an old 2nd edition Dungeons & Dragons campaign, and this guy's been around forever. And the player had a very specific idea for this character. It had a little red beard, had this kind of leather skull cap, coif type helmet that I think it was, and he is a cleric, and so he had a real specific idea of what this guy looked like. And there was an old Empire artillery crewman that absolutely looked exactly like this guy. So eventually I bought him, and he already has the book, which I think is appropriate for a cleric. I added a shield to his back. That is a pig on a roof. That is an in-joke. That is a hand-painted little detail on the back there. That is an in-joke with the character himself. And other than that, I just replaced the taper that he has, a little fuse for the cannon that he would normally be firing, and I replaced it with this little skull bit because he carries around a skull staff in the campaign. He has a very specific weapon. So anyway, that's that character there. So a couple minor conversions taken from a very specific model that fits the look that the character had in mind. And so I painted that up, and I'm using my Empire army as a warrior priest. So this little skull bit here was actually taken from an orc musician. So this is an old Brian Nelson orc musician back from 6th edition, I want to say. Anyway, he originally had a drum in his hand, and he was holding a stick, the little drumstick, and that's where that skull came from. But again, this is a model that I sort of did a little bit backwards. Long after I stopped playing this character, I went to make a musician for my Big Guns unit, for my Orc and Goblin army, and I went and I sculpted him up like this. This is probably the most elaborate conversion that I have. This is Feud Killjoy. He is from the old Earth Dawn role-playing game. Do you guys remember that? Probably not. It was in the 90s. It was big for a while. I think it kind of preceded a lot of the new Dungeons & Dragons themes. It was very... It was very rules restrictive. It kind of told you what you could do as opposed to what you couldn't do. And you had a lot of abilities for your characters, a lot of magical techniques and that kind of thing. And a lot of the game was just making your character and choosing the abilities and so forth. But I'm getting distracted here. Anyway, so this guy had been campaigning for quite a while before I went to make the miniature. So he had a lot of things that I needed to do to him. I really love this old big gun musician. I've used him a couple ways, never in the way that he was intended. I've always done a conversion of some kind, but he is great. So I used a lot of green stuff. I sculpted on a little bit of his hair there because he has a crop of red hair on this guy. And his comedy and tragedy masks, those are sculpted. That's actually relatively easy to do. You kind of just make a flat piece of putty and then carve out the shape and the eye holes, and then the rest is just a paint job. This is a little Skaven cloak that I added on. I had to green stuff over the stuff that goes over his shoulders, but otherwise that's just stuck on right there. He's got a specific sword that is an old plastic orc warrior sword, and then a little handle from the newer setup. And I went and sculpted on his armor. He originally has this chainmail, but the character himself uses this Espagra scale. It's basically like lizard scale armor. And so I stuck on a thin coat of green stuff all over that and carefully took the triangle tip of my sculpting tool and just pressed it down to make these little scale type things. It's actually easier than it looks. And then the concerto, or the accordion, that is a section of bendy straw, just regular plastic straw that bends. And this is actually a lot harder to do than I imagined. You think about that bendy straw and you think, yeah, it's exactly that shape. I'll just stick it on right there. But the thing is, it's real thin plastic and it kind of bends and smashes around quite a bit. And so when I went to do it, it was actually really hard to get it in the shape that I wanted. And there's a lot of fooling around. Anyway, the rest was relatively straightforward, except that I did have to sculpt a little bit of the hands and the straps and all that. So if those look a little wonky, that's the reason why, because they're actually green stuffed. I am not a fantastic sculptor, so I just try to get it close and then clean up what I can in the paint job. So yeah, that is Fugue Killjoy. That is my old orc troubadour from the Earth Dawn game. And he is the musician for my Big Guns unit. So yeah, I play a lot of orcs. I do like orcs. And so I use them in the role-playing games as well as in Warhammer Fantasy. And so I have another orc bard. This is from a 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons game. Now you might think two basically orc bards, because a troubadour in Earth Dawn is basically a bard in Warhammer, or excuse me, in Dungeons & Dragons. But these characters were like 15 years apart, 15, 20 years apart. So I think that's okay. I think I can play an orc bard every 10 to 20 years, and I think that's fine. This guy is actually not as elaborate a conversion as he first looks. This is basically an old, what is it? Would be 7th edition? Was that the box set with the orcs in the Empire? Anyway, he is an orc archer, and I have removed the bow, and so anyway, let's go over the conversion. So this hand would be holding the bow, and instead I just gave him a different hand with this mallet. And the mallet is just a little bit of, just two little bits of balsa wood dowel that I stuck together, although this is probably a plastic handle of some kind. Anyway, that was fairly straightforward. I love archers' hands. I love the hands that fire the arrow, because they are a way to get hand positions that you normally wouldn't. Normally, a Warhammer model is just holding something. It's got a fist, But the hands that fire arrows, you can do all kinds of things with. So in this case, I actually put a little skull in his hand, and I gave him a head. I repositioned it a little bit, and I gave him this ruff. He's sort of a Shakespearean playwright, is what this character is like. He wants to write plays. So I put a disc, basically a glob of green stuff, where his neck would be, and then I made little divots in it. How can I show you this? So I took a little sculpting tool and I just made these lines, radiating out, and I did the same thing on the edge. I kind of did in these little lines, and so it's actually a lot easier than it looks. I'm just scoring it this way, and then I'm scoring it that way and that way, and it turned out pretty good. I think it gives the impression. And then I put an Empire hat on his head. I think originally the This is an Empire Command model from an infantry unit, and it's meant to go on his head sideways, and he's got like this little under hat, but I just chopped it off and I put it on my orc head flat, because orc heads are a lot bigger, and I think that looks okay. And I sculpted on a little beard, because, you know, and he gets his big sword in the back too. So it's a lot of little bits, but not as much sculpting as you would actually think. Certainly not as much as Feud Killjoy over there. Anyway, that's Thalmort, my orc bard, from a 5th edition game. Let's see, what else we got? I'm going to save you for later. Here is another 5th edition D&D model. I'm using him as a swordsman champion in an Empire force, if I ever get a unit to go with him. But he is actually a Bretonnian, I want to say, from the Archer Regiment. Oh, yeah. So, cloaks. You know, every D&D player has to have every D&D character has to have a cloak. So a lot of these guys have cloaks added to them. This is from the White Wolf Knight sprue. This one here is from the Chaos Warrior sprue. I already told you this guy used a Skaven sprue. So whenever you get a sprue with cloaks on it, that's really handy for this kind of thing. Anyway, he is a Tempest cleric from a Viking land, but he has to keep shaving off his beard whenever he becomes too loutish, overeating, over drinking, that kind of thing. So he's constantly in a state of regrowing his beard. So I gave him a really short beard. The thing about this guy is that I want him to be overweight. I want him to have a big belly and that kind of thing. And there aren't a whole lot of Warhammer models that are kind of big and fat, that are human. There's some Chaos Warriors, but they tend to be unarmored. And so I use this guy because this is one of the few. The only problem with him is that he's actually kind of short. I wish he was taller. If anyone knows of a big fat Warhammer model that's a human that isn't like half naked like a Chaos Warrior, then that would be kind of nice, because I would prefer this guy to be a little larger, because he is a Viking. Anyway, so I had to add a couple horns. And that helmet, I think that helmet actually came, I think the head is the original guy with a little beard sculpted on. And then the helmet may have come from either an orc or a dwarf, and then I added a couple horns from somewhere. Anyway, standard shield, little design, White Wolf cloak we already noted. There is this little hammer doodad that I actually clipped off and replaced the little, stuck it on top of the Bretonnian symbol they originally had. I added a little bit more fur around the neck. And of course, this is an old plastic dwarf hammer that went on the end of his arm here. So that is that guy. It's a lot of bits and clipping and a little bit of sculpting. And I'm not, again, I wish he was a little bit bigger. But that's Stolveg of Fiskben, my Tempest cleric for a 5th edition game. And here's my most recent AD&D 5th edition character that I sculpted up. He is going to be just a militiaman in my free company. And that's basically what he is. It's all militiaman parts. The militia sprue is just fantastic. I wish they still made it. If you're playing Mordheim, if you're making these kind of characters, if you want free company, that's really what you want. But they're hard to find. They're expensive if they're not already, painted and clipped out and all that kind of thing. But if you can get your hands on it, that's absolutely great. I think this axe actually comes from a Mordheim Dreg, but don't worry about that. Whatever, axes are axes. He is actually a druid, and he's a shapeshifter druid. So, but I wanted him to be sort of like a groundskeeper Willy type. That's gone, druids make good groundskeepers. So he worked for a noble lord, and he's basically kind of this servant. And he's got a little wooden shield that I got from somewhere, a little design painted on the back, and I just stuck it on the back. And I gave him a lantern pole. This was actually an artillery crewman arm. It was holding the ramrod or whatever that is that you stuff the cannonball into the cannon with, or the gunpowder, whatever it is. Anyway, I replaced that with the lantern that comes from the Mordheim sprue. And again, I changed around this guy's hair, because one of the heads from the militia sprue is just really weird looking. He's got kind of this like fringy hair and beard kind of thing. So I just gave him a little bit fuller beard, and I think he looks a lot better like that. But since we are a druid, we get to turn into animals. So I've gone and pulled a couple animals. We get turned into a direwolf. So that's really easy. I had a direwolf already. This is from my Vampire Count's army. And so I just used that. And then I went on eBay and I found an old gigantic spider. This originally had a goblin writing on top of it. Now I actually have this same model and with the goblin writing on it. And so you wouldn't think there's much you can do with this thing in a Warhammer army, because when a goblin rides on a gigantic spider, it becomes monstrous cavalry, so you'll never have just the spider running around after the goblin gets killed on top of it, or at least I believe that's how it works. But there are a couple things that I can use that for. For example, in the Storm of Magic supplement, you can basically take regular monsters and put them into your army, and Gigantic Spider is one of them, so I can use that guy there. And the other is, there is a Mordheim gang called, there's a Mordheim gang for the Forest Goblins, and you can hire a Gigantic Spider in that too. So this is kind of a good thing about making these small models that can also fit into Warhammer armies. So even if you don't use that particular army, or if you don't think you have a use for that particular troop type, having it around gives you a step towards it. For example, I don't have a Lizardman army, but now I've got this guy, and I'll get to him in just a second. So that's a little skink priest. And if I have a skink priest, then I might think to myself, well, if I paint 10 more models, then I have a Lizardman Mordheim gang, So I've already got to start to that, and that makes it a little bit more achievable as far as that goes. And then once I have that Mordheim gang, I might think, well, maybe if I paint another 10 to 20 models, maybe I'll have like a 500-point Lizardman force. And so it's a way to step into sort of another phase of your miniature gaming, painting these small models for use in board games and role-playing games. Or at least that's the way I like to do it anyways, because, again, I am a slow painter, and so anything that kind of gets me a little bit closer to a project, keeps me going, keeps me enthusiastic, and makes it look not so insurmountable. So let's go on to some board games. So I've been playing a lot of Gloomhaven. It's a fun game. If you wanted to ask my opinion, and you're listening to me now, so I guess you got to hear it one way or the other. I would probably rather play Warhammer Quest, but that might be more for nostalgia than anything else. Anyway, it's not really so much of a miniature game. You get miniatures for the basic characters, but then the rest are cards. It's a fun game, but the miniatures, I don't know, they don't really inspire me. Plus, it's not my set, so I'm not going to paint them anyway. So when it came time to play this, eventually I got around to painting a model of my very own. And the first one I had was a Quattrel Tinkerer. So they're like these little inventor sciencey types, and they're like these feathered lizard guys. And so I tried to think about what would work out well. I thought about goblins, that kind of thing, but I really thought the closer character there would be a skink. And I remembered this old skink model here. He's got the feathers, which is nice because Quattrels, I believe, also has feathers. And he also has this sun staff. And the Lizardmen in the old Warhammer Fantasy game had these kind of science-y, magic-y things. And so he had this sun staff that was like a blasty beam weapon. And that's a little bit of what the Quattrel Tinkerer does at higher levels. Now, what I wanted to do was put like some little vials and potions strapped to the inside of his feathered cloak here. But when I went through my bits box, I couldn't find components that I really liked. It was really small, and I didn't want to take the time to sculpt them all. Probably should have. But in the end, the very next game, so I finally got this guy painted. And then the very next game that I played, this guy actually completed his big mission objective and had to retire. So that was the end of using that guy, first painted model, and then he has to go away right away. So, but that's okay. I do like the paint job. And like I said, now I got a little entry point to other games. And it does let me go on to my next Gloomhaven character, which was a Cragheart. And a Cragheart is like these stone people. And so I thought, well, that sounds like a stone troll to me. So I went and dug out this old Blood Bowl stone troll. Now, the thing about Craghearts is they have some kind of elemental focus kind of thing in their chest. And it's been, for a Cragheart, it's been gouged out. So I went and, so the only real conversion on this guy, except for the base, which I'll get to in a second, is that I went and he had this like little, he has this collar on the back of his neck. And there's like a little ring that drapes down in front of his chest. And so I took my Dremel tool and I just ground that out. I removed the little ring thing that hangs off of his collar. And then I just ground straight into his chest. And I ground this big cavity out and then took the X-Acto blade and just cut a couple more notches out. And then when I glued the whole thing together, I realized that his head hangs over his chest so far that no one's actually going to ever be able to see that. But oh well, I know that it's there. And so, yeah. Well, and that's the important thing, right? But the other thing is that for Gloomhaven, the game is played on these little hex grids, and this base is way too big to go on those hex grids. So what I actually did is that I drew out the size of those hexes. And then when I came home, said, I'm going to make myself a stone troll that I can use as this character. I cut out a piece of sheet metal, this little metal, like right here, that exact hex, that exact size. So I put down the little design that I drew, and I drew that out on here. And then I cut that out with regular scissors. May have messed up my scissors doing that, but whatever. I didn't have tin snips or anything, and it worked after a fashion. And then I took this 40 millimeter base. These 40 millimeter bases are getting hard to find now. I hope if Games Workshop redoes the Warhammer Fantasy that they allow you to buy just packs of the old square bases, because I'm running a little bit low. So anyway, I took the sanding Dremel bit, and I ground down the top of this base right here as far as it will go. Now you notice on this thing they've got these little handy holes for plugging in models, and they actually keep it intact when you grind this thing down. I didn't want to grind all the way through it, but I wanted to grind down far enough so that I could set a little bit of this sheet magnet. So this thin magnet material. And I just placed it in there because I didn't want it to stick up too much, because it was going to, if I did that, then this would stick up this thickness, and then the metal would go on top, and then the putty and all that kind of thing would all sit on top of there. And then I put a little putty around this little hexagon space. So I built that up on the little sheet metal. I glued the troll onto my little metal hexagon, and then I put a little putty down on there because I wasn't sure how well everything would stick to it. So I just, the putty is really sticky, and I thought it would stick onto the metal, and it looks like that I was right. And so when all said and done, kind of a long explanation, we have a troll who's got a little magnetized base, so that when I want to use him in Warhammer Fantasy, I can go and I can stick him on his 40 millimeter base, so we can go stomp around with the rest of the troll unit. And when I want to use him in Gloomhaven, I can remove him like that, and he can go in there. And of course this is nice too, because not only can I use him in Gloomhaven and Warhammer Fantasy, but he's also a Blood Bowl model. So if I ever want to expand the, into using, say, a Goblin team for Blood Bowl, now I'll have an extra troll to put on the front line, or if I want to hire a Ripper Boldgrot or something like that, even gave him a little number there. So anyway, that's Apex Crater Crest. That's my new Cragheart for Gloomhaven / Stone Troll for Warhammer Fantasy / Troll for Blood Bowl. This is Scrub Pew Pew, my Quattral Tinkerer, if you're curious about that. So yeah, there is an overview of all that. I don't know how helpful that is, but it's just me talking about old models and what I do to change them, to convert them into use for other games, because I'd like everything to kind of circle back around to my favorite miniature games. And of course, the same thing works for science fiction or whatever role-playing or board games you're doing. If you want to make something up for Warhammer 40k or Legion or anything like that, that all makes sense. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, go ahead and leave them below. Otherwise, that's about it. I will see you on the next one.